For thousands of years, ordinary people have done remarkably ordinary things. They chatted over fences, complained about prices, exaggerated yesterday's events, and quietly wondered what the neighbours were up to. The clothes changed. The languages changed. Entire empires rose and fell. Human conversation, however, remained wonderfully familiar. Today, history remembers kings, queens, and great battles. It remembers mighty empires, famous speeches, and world-changing discoveries. Yet, it remembers almost nothing about the neighbour whose goat kept eating everyone's vegetables, or the fisherman whose catch grew larger every time he told the story. We'll be changing that tonight. Tonight, we'll travel through several different periods, visiting Viking villages, Roman streets, Egyptian markets, medieval taverns, and Victorian neighbourhoods. Along the way, we'll overhear various small stories inspired by the conversations that history almost certainly forgot. Our first stop is a Viking village with one rather obvious problem. Nobody can seem to mind their own business. By the end of the day, the boats have returned, the fires are lit, and conversations spring up wherever 2 or 3 neighbours happen to meet. News spreads from doorstep to doorstep, growing ever so slightly more interesting with each retelling. It's a habit as old as the village itself. Leif's goat had become the village's favourite suspect. Missing vegetables, the goat. Broken fence, the goat. Chickens refusing to lay eggs, somehow, also the goat. By Saturday, one neighbour insisted he'd seen it standing on a roof surveying the village. Nobody believed him. They simply admired his commitment to the story. Eric's new boots looked expensive, which immediately made them everybody else's business. Some admired the craftsmanship, others questioned his priorities. It took remarkably little time for the village to dissect Eric's finances, career, ambition, and common sense, somehow turning a simple pair of boots into a complete assessment of Eric as a human being. The Harold Files. Harold changed his route home, and the neighbours had built an entire drama around this sudden change. Maybe a secret romance, a hidden enemy, or something more sinister. Mrs. Lindbergh recorded evidence in the Harold Files: departure time, direction, and whether he looked suspiciously happy. As it turns out, Harold had simply counted every crack in the old pavement already. The neighbours were disappointed. They were expecting a second family. The reputation. Bjorn was famous for being fearless. At least, that was what Bjorn told everyone. The villagers had heard hundreds of stories about his bravery. He had fought storms, beasts, and enemies from distant lands. Then one day, a spider crawled onto his sleeve. Bjorn screamed, threw his cloak into the fire, and refused to enter his own house until somebody braver checked every corner. The serious Viking. Ragnar was famous throughout the village for never laughing. At every feast, every story, and every celebration, he remained completely serious. The villagers believed he was incredibly wise and spent years wondering what deep thoughts filled his mind. Then one evening, someone told him a joke. Ragnar frowned and asked, "Didn't the chicken realize it could have just flown across?" We now enter medieval times, an age of castles and kingdoms where battles were fought, legends were created, and villagers still found plenty of time to discuss everyone else's business. The secret keeper. Agnes was the village fortune teller, famous throughout the village for knowing every secret before anyone else. People believed she had magical powers or some mysterious ability to uncover hidden truths. They came to her hoping she could reveal what the future held. The truth was far less impressive. Whenever someone said, "You must never tell anyone this," Agnes simply listened carefully and waited for the next person to arrive. The missing spoon. During the village feast, one spoon disappeared. It was not gold, it was not special, and nobody had ever noticed it before. Yet by the next morning, the entire village was searching for answers. Neighbours exchanged theories, families accused each other, and friendships nearly ended over a piece of cutlery. Soon, nobody cared about finding the spoon. They only cared about proving their neighbour was the sort of person who would take one. The man they all knew. Peter was one of the most familiar faces in the medieval village of Ashford. Everyone knew his cottage, his market stall, and family. The only problem was that nobody could remember his name. Rather than admit it, the villagers found increasingly creative ways to avoid saying it. They greeted him with "Good morrow, neighbour," "A pleasant day, good fellow," and eventually, "Greetings, you." The Giant Slayer. William returned from his travels with an extraordinary story. He claimed he had fought a giant deep in the forest, but luckily escaped with his life. The villagers were captivated. Every time the story was retold, someone added another detail. The giant became taller, stronger, and far more terrifying than before. By the end of the summer, the giant had acquired horns, razor-sharp claws, and X-ray vision. Nobody could remember who had added that part. The Witch's Cat. Agnes owned a black cat that followed her everywhere. At first, the villagers thought it was rather sweet. Then someone noticed the cat always seemed to appear before Agnes did. Another claimed it understood human conversation. Before long, people were certain it could predict the future, carry secret messages, and disappear. By the end of the month, Agnes was widely believed to spend her evenings flying through the night with the cat balanced neatly on her broomstick. Our journey now reaches ancient Egypt, a land of towering temples, bustling markets, curious gods, and neighbours who could transform the smallest rumour into a masterpiece. Giant fish. Nobody believed the fisherman when he first described his catch, which seemed unfair because the fish was already impressive enough. By midday, people were debating whether it could have fit in the boat at all. By evening, someone claimed it had dragged the fisherman halfway across the river. The next morning, a child asked why he had not simply tied the boat to the fish and let it do the travelling. New hairstyle. When Nefru arrived at the market with a new hairstyle, nobody mentioned it, which was how everyone knew it was the only thing being discussed. By afternoon, neighbours had decided it suggested wealth, rebellion, a secret admirer, or a disagreement with her husband. Nefru explained she had simply visited a different hairdresser. The following week, 3 women arrived wearing the same style and insisted they had thought of it first. Perfect statue. When the sculptor finished the statue, everyone agreed it was impressive, though they quickly became more interested in who it resembled. Some saw the official's expression. Others noticed the neighbour's nose. A few quietly suggested the sculptor had included features from several people. The sculptor insisted it was only one person, which somehow caused everyone to look around and decide who had been insulted. Broken vase. When the expensive vase shattered in the courtyard, everyone immediately remembered where they had been. Strangely, every person had been somewhere else entirely. The servant blamed the cat. The children blamed the wind. The cat blamed nobody, which many considered suspicious. The vase was repaired several days later, though the villagers continued discussing the accident as if the vase had been personally attacked. From the sands of Egypt, we journey across the Mediterranean to ancient Greece, where olive groves covered the hills, philosophers filled the marketplaces, and stories traveled almost as quickly as the people who told them. One afternoon, two villagers rested beneath an old olive tree. One remarked that it had seen more than any man alive. Unfortunately, a passing shepherd heard only part of the sentence. The baker naturally asked what it had witnessed. The shepherd admitted he had not heard that part, but suggested that if two elderly men were discussing it so seriously, it must have been worth remembering. This seemed entirely reasonable. By lunchtime, customers buying bread were quietly discussing the mysterious event the olive tree had apparently observed many years earlier. Before long, people began supplying their own possibilities. One woman believed a famous general had rested beneath its branches. A fisherman insisted a traveling poet had once written a masterpiece while sitting beside its trunk. A potter suggested it had survived a terrible earthquake that nobody else could quite remember. Every explanation sounded convincing because everyone else nodded thoughtfully after hearing it. The old tree itself continued behaving exactly as it always had. Sparrows landed among its branches. Children climbed halfway up before being shouted at by their parents. Goats occasionally attempted to eat its lower leaves. None of this discouraged the growing legend. If anything, people decided the tree's calm appearance proved it possessed a quiet dignity that ordinary trees simply lacked. Travelers soon began hearing about the remarkable olive tree before they entered the town. Some paused respectfully beneath its branches, others touched the bark for good luck. One visitor spent nearly an hour sketching it from different angles because someone had mentioned it was probably the wisest tree in Greece. Nobody was entirely certain what a wise tree looked like, but everyone agreed this one looked close enough. The local storyteller recognized an excellent opportunity when he saw one. During evening gatherings, he began mentioning the famous olive tree whenever audiences seemed distracted. Each performance introduced another small detail. The tree had sheltered philosophers during long discussions. The tree had witnessed secret meetings. The tree had somehow inspired a celebrated sculptor. The audience accepted each addition with quiet admiration. Within weeks, neighboring villagers were sending visitors simply to stand beneath its branches. Some expected to experience profound thoughts. Others hoped for unexpected wisdom. A few admitted they merely wished to see what all the excitement was about. Most left slightly disappointed, although several returned home, claiming the tree somehow felt different from ordinary trees after all. Meanwhile, the two elderly neighbours continued meeting beneath the tree each morning. They occasionally noticed strangers examining the branches with unusual seriousness, but assumed they were simply enjoying the shade. Neither realized that their brief conversation had become the foundation of a story now travelling further than either of them ever had. One afternoon, a young traveller politely asked one of the old men whether the famous story about the olive tree was really true. The neighbour looked up at the familiar branches, thought for a moment, and replied, "It's an excellent tree." The traveller smiled, thanked him for confirming everything, and hurried away to tell everyone exactly what he had heard. Marcus had lived on the same street in Rome for nearly 30 years, which meant he knew exactly when the baker opened, which neighbour argued every Thursday, and which paving stones should be avoided after rain. It also meant everyone knew Marcus well enough to wave as he passed, although very few people had any idea what he actually did for a living. One warm morning, a messenger arrived carrying an official-looking scroll sealed with bright red wax. He asked loudly whether anyone knew where Marcus lived. Before Marcus had time to answer, 3 neighbours pointed in different directions. 2 children began following the messenger, and an elderly woman announced that she had always suspected something important would eventually happen to him. The messenger handed Marcus the scroll, waited while he broke the seal, and then frowned. After a long silence, Marcus quietly explained that the document was addressed to a different Marcus entirely. The messenger apologized, rolled the scroll back up, and continued down the street. Most people accepted this explanation. A few felt it raised more questions than it answered. By the afternoon, neighbours were discussing why the government had been looking for Marcus in the first place. Some believed he had been chosen for an important position. Others were certain he owed someone a considerable amount of money. One man insisted the emperor rarely sent messengers without an excellent reason, despite having no idea whether the emperor had sent this one at all. The following morning, another messenger appeared, asking for a completely different Marcus. This did little to calm the rumours. Instead, people became convinced that officials were quietly searching the neighbourhood for something they preferred not to discuss in public. Every unfamiliar face suddenly became a possible government messenger, and every rolled-up piece of parchment attracted immediate attention. Shopkeepers began lowering their voices whenever Marcus entered. Children politely asked whether he had heard anything from Rome, apparently forgetting they were already standing in Rome. Even his barber carefully mentioned that, should Marcus require complete discretion for any official business, he could always arrange appointments before sunrise. Marcus continued living exactly as he always had. He bought bread, visited the market, complained about the weather, and occasionally stopped to watch builders repairing the road. Unfortunately, his determination to behave normally was widely interpreted as the calm confidence of a man carrying important secrets. Several weeks later, the real Marcus finally received his official document. It turned out to concern a small tax disagreement involving 2 missing goats and an unusually complicated property boundary. The matter was settled before lunchtime and forgotten almost immediately. Marcus's mysterious reputation, however, survived for years. New neighbours were quietly informed that he was a man of considerable importance, although nobody could quite remember why. Marcus eventually stopped asking what people thought he had done. The answers became more imaginative every year, and he found they were usually more interesting than the truth. Our journey now carries us to feudal Japan. where quiet temples overlooked peaceful villages, cherry blossoms drifted on the breeze, and even the smallest mystery could keep the entire neighbourhood talking for weeks. Ichiro removed his sandals outside the village tea house, exactly as everyone else did. He enjoyed a quiet cup of tea, thanked the owner, and stepped back outside to discover that one sandal had disappeared. The other remained exactly where he had left it, looking as surprised as anyone could reasonably expect a sandal to look. The tea house owner apologized immediately. Every customer insisted they had seen nothing unusual. Several people carefully inspected the remaining sandal as though it might reveal important clues. Before long, a small crowd had formed, each person contributing a different theory, despite none of them having witnessed the sandal's disappearance. A traveling merchant suggested someone had stolen it by mistake. A farmer believed a dog had carried it away. An elderly woman quietly wondered whether fox spirits occasionally borrowed footwear for reasons best left unexplored. Nobody could explain why a fox spirit would require only one sandal, although this was generally accepted as part of their mysterious nature. Children eagerly searched beneath benches, inside barrels, and around the nearby stream. Each unsuccessful discovery somehow made the mystery more exciting. By the afternoon, people had begun speaking about the missing sandal as though it were a respected member of the village who had unexpectedly left without saying goodbye. Children eagerly searched beneath benches, inside barrels, and around the nearby stream. Each unsuccessful discovery somehow made the mystery more exciting. By the afternoon, people had begun speaking about the missing sandal as though it were a respected member of the village who had unexpectedly left without saying goodbye. The village carpenter produced an elegant theory involving crows, shiny objects, and unusually ambitious nesting habits. The potter rejected this completely, insisting the sandal had probably floated away during last week's rain, despite everyone remembering that it had not rained for several days. Neither explanation suffered from a lack of confidence. The village monk listened patiently to every suggestion, before gently observing that perhaps someone had simply misplaced it. This possibility was politely ignored because it solved the mystery far too quickly. The missing sandal had already become considerably more interesting than an ordinary mistake. Travelers passing through the village soon heard the story and naturally added details before carrying it onward. In one version, the sandal had vanished during a sudden gust of wind. In another, it had been stolen by an exceptionally polite monkey. By the time the tale reached the neighboring village, people were discussing the disappearance of an entire pair. 3 days later, the sandal was discovered beneath a wooden bench where it had quietly slipped between two support beams. Nobody could explain how dozens of determined searchers had failed to notice it. Several villagers suggested it must have moved on its own after everyone had gone home. Even after the sandal was safely returned, visitors occasionally asked where the famous disappearance had taken place. The tea house owner would point towards the bench, nod thoughtfully, and say, "That is where the trouble began," as though speaking of a great historical event rather than a remarkably ordinary piece of footwear. Our journey now carries us to Imperial China. where magnificent palaces overlooked peaceful gardens, scholars pursued wisdom, and sometimes the most important figure at court was neither an emperor nor a minister. The first time the panda wandered into the imperial palace, nobody knew quite what to do. It ambled through the eastern gate, ignored the guards entirely, and made its way towards the royal kitchens, where a young servant quietly offered it a few bamboo shoots. The panda accepted the gift, wandered away without so much as a glance, and disappeared into the surrounding hills. It seemed like a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The following morning, the panda returned. This time, it walked confidently through the palace grounds as though it had every right to be there. The same servant greeted it with another handful of bamboo, and once again, the panda wandered away completely satisfied. By the third visit, people had begun noticing. By the fourth, they had begun talking. One palace official suggested the panda had deliberately chosen the emperor's palace above every other place in the kingdom. Another quietly observed that such a creature surely possessed excellent judgment. Before long, nobody wanted to be the person who dismissed an animal that everyone else appeared to respect. Soon, servants bowed politely as the panda passed. Gardeners carefully stepped aside whenever it wandered across the paths. Even senior officials paused their conversations until it had finished inspecting whichever flower bed had captured its attention. The panda accepted this growing admiration with complete indifference and continued searching for snacks wherever they happened to appear. The emperor eventually heard about his unusual visitor and asked why the court seemed so fascinated by a particularly relaxed bear. His ministers immediately began offering thoughtful explanations. One believed the panda represented harmony. Another claimed it symbolized prosperity. A third suggested it had arrived as a sign that the heavens approved of the emperor's wise rule. None of them had considered asking why the panda kept visiting the kitchens. As the weeks passed, the panda's routine became part of palace life. Courtiers quietly discussed where it had been seen each morning. If it wandered into the western gardens, people wondered whether it preferred the flowers there. If it sat beneath a willow tree for an hour, several scholars attempted to explain the deeper meaning of the decision. The panda's own explanation was considerably simpler. That particular spot happened to be comfortable. Eventually, visiting ambassadors began requesting permission to see the famous palace panda. Some considered it a great honor simply to watch it eat bamboo in peaceful silence. Others returned home convinced they had witnessed an ancient imperial tradition passed down for centuries. Nobody wished to admit the entire custom had begun only a few weeks earlier with one hungry bear and a kind-hearted kitchen servant. Our journey now carries us to the Wild West, where dusty streets stretch beneath endless skies, stagecoaches rattle between distant towns, and an ordinary misunderstanding could travel faster than a galloping horse. Samuel arrived in the little frontier town just after sunrise, carrying nothing more than a worn suitcase and an exceptionally impressive moustache. Nobody recognized him, which was unusual because strangers rarely visited without giving everyone something to discuss. Before he had even reached the hotel, 3 different people had already invented three entirely different reasons for his arrival. The barber was certain Samuel had come to arrest somebody. The blacksmith believed he was searching for hidden gold. The hotel owner quietly suggested he looked far too tidy to be either, which naturally convinced everyone he must be working undercover. Samuel, meanwhile, was simply looking for the post office. When Sam asked for directions, the townsfolk became even more suspicious. Why would a man travel hundreds of miles just to visit the post office? Someone decided he must be collecting secret government papers. Another insisted he was carrying important messages between distant cities. Nobody considered the possibility that he merely wanted to send a letter. By lunchtime, children had begun following him at a respectful distance while pretending not to stare. Shopkeepers greeted him with unusual politeness. One elderly gentleman even thanked him for everything he was doing, although neither of them knew what that referred to. Samuel spent the afternoon wandering from building to building because the post office had closed unexpectedly for repairs. Unfortunately, this made him appear even more mysterious. Every stop became another clue. Every conversation became another secret meeting. Every glance over his shoulder was interpreted as the careful caution of a man carrying great responsibility. The town sheriff eventually introduced himself and politely asked whether Samuel required any assistance. Samuel smiled with obvious relief and explained he was trying to mail a birthday card to his aunt. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully, wished him good luck, and walked away. By evening, the entire town agreed that only a truly important government agent would invent such an ordinary excuse. Samuel finally posted his birthday card the following morning before boarding the next stagecoach out of town. Years later, the townsfolk still spoke of the mysterious stranger with the magnificent moustache who had briefly appeared, completed whatever secret mission he had undoubtedly been sent to accomplish, and vanished without leaving behind a single answer. Our journey now carries us to the age of pirates, where wooden ships crossed restless seas, maps promised impossible fortunes, and even seasoned sailors could spend weeks arguing over something completely ridiculous. Captain Briggs had owned the same treasure map for nearly 20 years. It was yellow with age, covered in mysterious markings, and folded so many times that nobody could remember its original shape. Every sailor who visited the tavern asked to see it. Every sailor claimed to understand it. Unfortunately, no two sailors agreed on which way up it should be held. The arguments began quietly enough. One sailor insisted the compass rose clearly pointed north. Another argued it had faded and was obviously pointing west instead. Before long, half the tavern had gathered around the table, rotating the map every few minutes and becoming increasingly confident with each new position. By the second evening, people had stopped discussing the treasure entirely. The real debate was whether the island resembled a turtle, a boot, or Captain Briggs' left ear. Someone borrowed charcoal to redraw the coastline. Another borrowed the charcoal back to correct it. The map soon contained so many extra notes that nobody could remember which marks had been there originally. Visiting sailors eagerly joined the discussion. One claimed he had sailed past the island years earlier. Another insisted it did not exist at all. A third recognized the handwriting and confidently announced it belonged to a famous pirate who had been dead for decades before the map had supposedly been drawn. Captain Briggs rarely interrupted. He simply listened while strangers explained every detail of a map they had never seen before that afternoon. Occasionally, someone would ask his opinion. Briggs would glance down at the parchment, nod thoughtfully, and reply, "It certainly looks like a map." Weeks passed, and the arguments became something of an attraction. New crews visited the tavern specifically to contribute fresh theories. One evening, two experienced navigators spent 3 hours debating the location of a mountain that might not even have been a mountain. Neither man noticed that the barmaid had quietly turned the map upside down halfway through the discussion. Late one rainy afternoon, the tavern owner asked Captain Briggs whether he intended to search for the treasure at all. Briggs smiled, carefully folded the map, and admitted that he had already looked years ago. There had been no treasure. The tavern fell silent. Briggs shrugged and slipped the old map back into his pocket. "It was never the treasure people came to see," he said. "It was the argument." The following evening, every seat around the table was full again. This time, they were arguing about whether Captain Briggs had been telling the truth. From pirates and treasure maps, we step into Victorian England, where life was considerably more orderly, although the misunderstandings were every bit as adventurous. At precisely 7:30 on a cool autumn morning, Mr. Pembroke arrived outside Henderson's bakery, carrying nothing more than a pocket watch and a remarkable talent for punctuality. The shop did not open until 8 o'clock, but he had always preferred arriving early. He tipped his hat to the empty street, folded his hands behind his back, and waited patiently by the door. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Ellis approached, carrying a basket of washing. She noticed Mr. Pembroke standing outside the bakery, and immediately assumed something special must be happening. Being far too polite to ask what it was, she simply took her place behind him. Mr. Pembroke glanced over his shoulder, smiled courteously, and returned to watching the closed door. Mrs. Ellis smiled back. Neither of them said a word. Another neighbour arrived a few minutes later and was delighted to discover he was apparently just in time. Whatever was being offered had clearly attracted a queue already. Rather than risk missing out, he quietly joined the end. Within half an hour, 15 perfectly respectable Victorians were standing in a neat line, each privately wondering what everyone else seemed to know. Speculation spread much faster than the queue itself. One gentleman was certain Henderson had acquired an exceptional shipment of imported tea. A lady in a feathered hat believed the bakery must be giving away free cakes to celebrate an anniversary. Someone else whispered that it involved the royal family, although nobody could explain how the royal family had become connected to a baker in a quiet London street. Pedestrians slowed to admire the growing line. Most assumed they had stumbled across an important event. Since asking would have been terribly awkward, they simply joined the queue themselves. Several newcomers nodded knowingly, despite having absolutely no idea why they were there. By 8 o'clock, the line stretched around the corner. The baker unlocked the door, looked outside, and froze. He had never seen so many customers in his life. Thinking quickly, he smiled broadly and announced, "Good morning, everyone." The crowd nodded back with quiet satisfaction. Whatever they had been waiting for was evidently about to begin. The first customer entered. "What can I get for you?" asked Henderson. Mr. Pembroke looked mildly surprised. "Oh, just one loaf of bread, please." The bakery fell silent. The second customer stepped forward. "I'll have a loaf as well." "So will I." "And me." Within 15 minutes, every loaf in the bakery had been sold. The people at the back of the queue left slightly disappointed, but quietly convinced they had almost witnessed something rather important. The following morning, Mr. Pembroke arrived at 7:30 as usual. This time, there were already 23 people waiting behind him. Nobody wished to risk missing whatever had happened yesterday. As the 19th century drew to a close, thousands of hopeful prospectors traveled north to the frozen wilderness of the Klondike, each quietly convinced they might be the next person to strike gold. Most discovered that the mountains contained rather more snow than treasure, although this did little to discourage them. Walter Higgins believed he possessed a remarkable talent. He was convinced he could recognize gold the moment sunlight touched it. This confidence came from one fortunate afternoon several months earlier, when he had correctly identified a genuine gold nugget on his very first attempt. Walter rarely mentioned that the next 150 sparkling stones he proudly identified had turned out to be something considerably less valuable. Every morning, Walter could be found strolling along the riverbank with his trousers rolled to the knee and his pockets already bulging with interesting discoveries. Whenever something glittered beneath the water, he would gasp quietly, roll up his sleeves a little higher, and retrieve it with enormous care, as though lifting a priceless jewel from the bottom of the river. His excitement was impossible to ignore. Within minutes, nearby prospectors would wander over to inspect the latest discovery. Walter would polish the stone carefully on his coat, hold it towards the light, narrow his eyes with impressive concentration, and announce, "Now this has all the signs." Someone would turn the stone over once or twice, before gently replying, "It's quartz." Walter would smile cheerfully. "Excellent quality quartz." The following stone would receive exactly the same enthusiasm. Somehow, Walter's optimism became infectious. Prospectors who had spent miserable weeks digging frozen ground found themselves smiling again whenever he appeared. Even those who knew perfectly well he was almost always wrong could not resist wandering over to hear his latest announcement. It was difficult to remain gloomy while watching a grown man become genuinely delighted by what was, more often than not, an unusually shiny pebble. Soon people began bringing Walter their own discoveries. "What do you make of this one?" Walter never rushed his judgment. He examined every rock with the seriousness of a museum curator. Some he sniffed, others he tapped gently against another stone. A few he held at arm's length before tilting his head thoughtfully, as though waiting for the rock to reveal its intentions. Finally, he would nod. "Oh yes." The owner leaned forward eagerly. "It is definitely interesting." Nobody knew precisely what qualified a rock as interesting, but Walter managed to identify an astonishing number of them. Before long, the camp had developed a curious routine. Prospectors searched for gold all morning before taking their favorite discoveries to Walter for what became known as the official opinion. His verdicts grew steadily more elaborate. "This one has tremendous promise. I admire its confidence. If this isn't gold, it is making an exceptional effort." The geologist staying at the camp quietly corrected Walter whenever he happened to pass. "Pyrite, mica, quartz again. That's part of somebody's old shovel." Walter accepted every correction with complete good humor. "Splendid," he would reply. "We're narrowing it down." The local merchant quickly recognized an opportunity. He began selling polished wooden boxes, labeled Walter's most promising specimens, each containing a handful of perfectly ordinary shiny stones gathered from around the camp. Visitors bought them faster than he could fill the boxes, convinced they were taking home a small piece of Klondike history. Even Walter purchased one. He admired the collection for several minutes before pointing to a particularly glittering stone in the corner. "I remember that one," he said proudly. "I was almost certain it was gold." The merchant smiled. So was everyone else. Years later, when old prospectors met to share stories of the Klondike, they rarely remembered exactly how much gold they had found. They remembered frozen rivers, worn-out boots, endless cups of coffee, and Walter Higgins, the only man who could look at an ordinary pebble and see limitless possibility. Some said he never found much gold. Others pointed out that he found something to be excited about every single day, and, considering how difficult life in the Klondike could be, that may have been the rarer discovery.